Hello, hello. Come on in for the live Story of Redemption discussion on the book of John. Today we're going through the whole book of John. And so as you're logging on now or later, will you let me know, was this the first time that you've ever read the book of John? Have you read it before? And how did you compare it? How did you like it compared to the other Gospels? John is one of my favorite books of the Bible, and if it's okay to have a favorite gospel, it would be my favorite. I loved reading each of them and seeing the different details as we've read. Luke, some of the emphasis on the poor, on women. Mark, such extreme miracles and the immediacy of everything. Matthew, Jesus is a fulfillment of the law. But there's something sweet about John for me too. And so what about you? How did you like it compared to the other books of the Bible? And as I'm making sure that I am logged in, can you see me okay? Are we doing all right? So I'm going to go ahead and pray to start, and then we will jump right into the book of John. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, God, as we're coming in the middle of a week, I know that there are women coming from all states of mind, from all kinds of weeks. I pray for those who have had really difficult weeks, who have had hard family times or personal struggles or hard days at work. God, I pray that your word would refresh them, encourage them, equip them for the remaining days of this week, and that you would guide my words to be an encouragement and like healing balm to them. And God, I pray for those who are having really great weeks, that you would use that energy that they have from the week to dig into your word with increased vigor and increased joy, increased energy and delight. And I pray that as we read about you, Jesus, in the book of John, that you would just open our eyes to another layer of who you are, of your love for us. And as we're talking about the various stories about Lazarus, about you being the Word came flesh, about you dealing with Peter, about these different stories, God, would you allow us to see how you relate to our own lives and know who you are even better? And so, God, bless this time, guide my words, I pray, and I pray that this time would be an encouragement and a blessing to all who are coming now or later. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Alrighty, so I am a little brain tired today, and I always pray right before I get on, but today as well, my husband had my kids pray over me as well, and my husband, and so we are prayed for. I'll let you know that we have been prayed for very well. One housekeeping thing before we jump into the book of John. Next week, my kids have a ballet show at 7 p.m. and so I will not be on at 7:30 p.m. So what we're going to do is we're going to move it to 3 o'clock. I will post that day as a reminder. I've already updated it in the schedule. I'm pretty sure. I'm going to check that. But just so you know, so you can write it in your calendar, we're not meeting next week at 7 p.m. We're going to be meeting at 3 p.m. And this will hopefully be the last time that we have to change the schedule through the end of the year. Hopefully, Lord willing, that'll be it. So that is my housekeeping thing. And as you're hopping on now or later, I would just love to hear what your thoughts about the book of John were. Did you like it? Had you read it before? What were your thoughts? What themes did you notice? And we will go ahead and jump in. All right, hey Beatrice, glad you're here. Awesome. How did you like the book of John? What were your thoughts compared to the other Gospels? And had you read it before, or is this your first time? Let's also, while you're answering, jump in. We're going to start with John 1. And we are going to focus in on a couple of things in the next couple of minutes. John 1 being a key thing, partly because it has so many of the key themes that we will discuss and have discussed in the whole Bible, but specifically will in the book of John. So we're going to focus in on John 1. We're going to focus in on the I am statements. So throughout the book of John, Jesus says I am a lot. And those are really important things. You are what? What are you, Jesus? And so we're going to talk about those, what Jesus says and who he says that he is. We're going to stop in at John chapter 11 and talk about Lazarus and the story there, and we're just going to keep going. I hope we have time for John 15 and the last book of the Bible with Peter. And so what themes did you notice so far? Hey, Irina, your second time. I'm so glad you're here. Awesome. Was it different reading it this time around at all? Did you notice anything different? A second go at it. So, Book of John. Who is John? Early tradition ascribes the author of this book as John, who often referred to himself as the beloved disciple. And so there are, like I said, many key themes within this first chapter, so we'll start there. Some of the words to be looking for are life, light, witness, true, world, and truth. Those being some key themes. And so let's talk about those as we read. I'm going to go ahead and jump in John chapter 1, and we will just read it, and we'll talk about it. So it says, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that should remind us of something. That should remind us of Genesis 1. In the beginning, that phrase, in the beginning what? Think back to Genesis when God created the whole world. God was there in the beginning. And now it's saying in the beginning, not only God the Father was there, but Jesus, the Word, was also there. It's going to say that the Word is called, it's going to attribute that to Jesus in, I think it's verse 17, the Word and Jesus being the same. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life that was the light of men. So again, these themes, light, life. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light. Again, theme of light in a dark world, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, John was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, verse 9, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. And so we're seeing a couple key things we'll talk about in a second. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh, and flesh dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him, and he cried out and he said, he is the one who comes after me ranks up before me, because he was before me. Verse 16, for from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So that's really big, underline that. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Okay, so I hope you read that when we were doing the reading. Anyways, but just as a refresher, this idea of the Word. What do you learn about Jesus from John chapter 1? Hey, Linda, glad you're here. What do you learn about the Word? What do you learn about Jesus through this first chapter in the book of John? So in this time, in this society, which was primarily a non-literary society, the Word was an all-important form of currency for law, trade, religion, marriage, reputation. Receipts, agreements, and records usually didn't have as much of a value because people didn't know how to read and write many times. And so personal integrity and truth speaking were very important. And so people were storytellers, they were poets. This idea, bringing this fullness to the word, we're seeing that this Word was also Jesus. The Word was from the beginning, divine, and yet having this relationship with God, we're seeing this glimpse into the Trinity of who God is, that God is more than just God the Father, but God is 3 in 1. We'll find out as we keep reading. We're seeing, there's so much that we could talk about the word logos or logos, in terms of what that means and why specifically that word was chosen. Interestingly, some scholars say that this word was familiar in Greek philosophy, And so it was talking about the reason within a man. So by using this term, some scholars say, John was relating Jesus to a culture beyond Judaism. And so to this cosmic, all cultures of the first century, that even in the word choice, that Jesus came to save those who are lost, not just the Jews, but for all. Okay, so what do you see? What do you learn about Jesus from this passage? The word life, like we said, was mentioned a lot. It's going to be used 36 times in the book of John, which is 40% of all times the word is used in the whole New Testament. So it's used a lot. This is a big theme. The idea that Jesus is able to grant life to those who walk in darkness, to those who are dead, is a big thing. So the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And all of this should remind us of themes of the Old Testament, like we underlined there, about Moses giving the law, but grace and truth coming through Jesus. If you read any of the volume 1, 2, or 3 with us, we talked a lot about the law. What is the law? What is the purpose of the law? The law reveals our heart. It shows us what's good. The law is good, but we saw over and over that we cannot fulfill it, that we are not good enough. And we saw plenty of people in the Old Testament try to do that, and they kept failing. They needed an intermediary, they needed a mediator, they needed someone to do it perfectly. And so we're seeing now this fulfillment of the law through Jesus. If you remember back also to Deuteronomy 18, it talked about how God was going to raise up a prophet like Moses from among the brothers. And it talks about how basically, where is it? This is Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 18, if you want to dig into that later. But it says, I will raise up from them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak all that I've commanded him. And so we're seeing finally, this is the fulfillment. This is what we've been waiting for. Jesus is the one that we have been waiting for. So comments, that he existed with God since the beginning. I love it. So Jesus was there at the beginning when the world was formed out of a breath. How beautiful that he wasn't God's plan B. It wasn't like, oops, people failed and they sinned and we got to figure this out, people. But that Jesus was there from the beginning, and God knew everything that was going to happen, and that this wasn't his plan B. Jesus wasn't his plan B. Okay, so the book of John is sometimes referred to as the book of signs because the first half has a lot of signs in it. And there are some miracles that are specifically unique to the book of John. And so if you want to write some of these down just to know it or to look into it later, water turning into wine for chapter 2, the official son healed in chapter 4, the paralytic was healed in chapter 5, blind man healed in chapter 9, verse 1 through 12, Lazarus raised from the dead in chapter 11, and the miraculous catch of fish in chapter 21, right as Jesus is about to go back to heaven. And so those are some of the unique miracles to the book of John. But what were some that you noticed? And as you're answering, time is kind of flying by, but like I said at the beginning, throughout the book of John, Jesus used this phrase, I am, a bunch. And so here's a question for you. What did Jesus say that he is? Who is Jesus, and how did he reveal himself in this book? What are some of the things that you noticed that Jesus said? I found this little helpful, you can see my notes, but this little helpful diagram that has the verse and what it says. But as you're answering and as you're thinking about some of the things that Jesus said, I am blank, what did he say? Interestingly, some of the times that Jesus says, I am blank, he also connects it to a characteristic or a miracle about who he is or what he is. So, for example, shortly after Jesus feeds the 5,000 people, he claims to be the bread of life. So that's one of the things that Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And he says that shortly after he feeds 5,000 people. Just before he heals the blind man in chapter 9, Jesus calls himself the light of the world. So he's opening the eyes of this man who cannot see, right? After he calls himself the light of the world. Immediately before raising Lazarus from the dead, he claims to be the resurrection and the life. Here's a couple of these. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world, the gate for the sheep, the good shepherd, resurrection and the life, the way, the truth, and the life, the true vine, and a king. Just some things that we could dig into each one of those a lot more, but for time we won't. So we're going to go actually ahead and look into chapter 11 with Jesus healing Lazarus who had died. Irina, I am the Son of Man. Yeah, Mark talked about that a lot. I remember the Son of God and the Son of Man was a huge theme in Mark. That's a good one that is used for sure throughout the Gospels. Okay, chapter 11, the death of Lazarus. Okay, so we're going to camp here for a couple minutes and then we will keep going. But this story, basically Lazarus, Martha, and Mary were really close with Jesus. And word got sent to Jesus that Lazarus was sick, that he was going to die. And it says, because he loved them, he stayed a couple extra days. He heard that Lazarus was sick. He knew that he was sick. It's not that he didn't know or hadn't been informed, even from a fleshly perspective. He knew. And even with that information, he chose to stay where he was a little bit longer. And so, like we said, right in this story, we see that Jesus is the resurrection and he is the life. And that is one of the reasons why he chose to stay, that he wanted all of the people there, especially Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, to know this truth about him, that he is the resurrection and he is the life. Whoever believes in me, it says, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. So, what can we learn about this story? We see that Jesus waits, and then he's going to come, and he's going to have this interaction with Martha and with Mary, and then he's going to go and call Lazarus out from being dead, and he's going to heal him from death. He's going to make him come alive again. So what do we learn about Jesus from this story? One of the things is the resurrection isn't just a doctrine. It is a doctrine, right? It is the resurrection is a key theological principle that we have and that we can hope in, but it's also a person. It was standing right in front of them. So when Jesus comes, Martha's going to run to him and say, teacher, if you had been here, then my brother would not have died. And they're going to have this conversation. So the way that Jesus is going to relate to Martha and Mary are very different. And I just love this. So let's look at this. This is chapter 11, verse 17 to 27 is where he's talking to Martha. And so Martha says, or Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, I know he's going to rise again on the last day. Jesus responds, I am the resurrection and the life, that verse I just said. And she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is coming into the world. So when she says this statement, she's actually using, I forget the English term, but like a present participle, or what is it? The kind of verb where it means I believe now and I will believe in the future. So she's affirming not only her current belief, but also her future belief in this Jesus. She also says a couple of different titles for him. She calls him Lord, Christ, and the Son of God. And so as she's relating with Jesus, they're having this conversation, and Jesus is teaching her through this conversation, through kind of a theology conversation about the resurrection. Like we said about the resurrection not just being a doctrine, but a person, you can see here that she wanted Jesus to be here. It's like when you're sick, you just don't want the doctrine or the medicine book. You want a doctor. When you are being sued, you don't want a law book, you want a lawyer. And so we're seeing here that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. It is more than a doctrine, it is a person, it is Jesus. And he has come in this case. So the way that we're going to see him respond to Mary, though, is very different. She says the same thing. She says, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. But he's going to weep with her. He's going to, in verse, where are we? In chapter 11, verse 33, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And so just because God knows everything, just because he can do everything, doesn't mean that he doesn't weep with us, and doesn't mean that he can't be confided in, that he doesn't empathize with pain and suffering, that we can't go to him in our struggles and expect a friend. And not only the resurrection, but someone who will weep with us. And so something that I was thinking about with this story too is just the fact that God's timing is sometimes different than what we want, right? So obviously Lazarus was going to die, and they wanted him to come right away so that he wouldn't die. And in God's providence, according to his wisdom, he waited. And how many times do we think timing would be better if it went like this, for my getting married, or my having kids, or getting this job? God, I know the perfect timing, and this is what it is. It'll be a beautiful story. I'll sing your praises if you can just allow it to happen like this in this timeline. And that's not always what God does, right? Even with my, I've shared with you that we're in the process of adoption and church planting. And a couple of months ago, we were supposed to launch the church plant in October. Due to a series of events, we pushed it back a couple months. And in my mind, I was like, this is perfect. God is pushing back the launch of Grace Church so that we can adopt a baby, we can get him sleeping through the night, we'll be up and ready, by the time that we have to be there, like full force, whatever, with the church plant. And it is now middle of November, and still we are waiting in the adoption process. That this timing of God's is different, and even in that, I can trust him. And so we're seeing that, again, all of this was intentional, that Jesus waited on purpose because he wanted to teach them something. And whenever God waits or says no or says not yet, we know and we can trust that he's using it for our good. But sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And that's where faith comes in, that we have to believe in faith that he is working all of it for our good and he's doing it on purpose. Okay, so you said that if we believe, we resurrect with him. That's a beautiful point. So exactly. So if we believe in Jesus, we have this promise of resurrection in the future. We know that when we die, that's not the end of it. That is not the end game. It's as it says, as Paul later says, death, where is your victory? Where is your sting? It's gone, because Jesus has paid the penalty of death, and we know that we will be with God in heaven. Excuse me. So I love that point. That's an awesome summary. So let's go ahead and move forward to John 15 for a second, and then we'll end with a book. So just a couple things here. John 15 about the true vine. I just love this. So there's so much that we could talk about here, but Jesus is saying, he's talking to his disciples. He's having this intimate moment with them in chapter 15, 16, and 17. He's praying for them. He's praying for himself, for the disciples, and for all believers. He's praying for us. But these couple things here, abide, this phrase abide, is going to be mentioned 10 times before verse 10. And so we're seeing this theme of remaining with God, remaining in the vine, remaining close to God's love, to Jesus's love. And we're seeing that it's held up through prayer. And so that'll be all we talk about it with here, but we're seeing that faithfulness is a goal of the disciples. It is this desire of Jesus that they would remain faithful, that they would abide. And how can they do that? In part through prayer, primarily through prayer, through this dependence on God. And like I said, he's praying for unity and boldness and protection and all these things for not only the disciples, but he's also praying for us, for all the believers that are to come. How cool is that, to know that Jesus was specifically praying for you and for me and for all the believers that you know that Jesus actually was praying for them, as we see here in John chapter 17. Okay, so you said we have to believe in him and pray with joy, for sure. That the joy, exactly what you're saying, tied up with the resurrection, that we have joy because we have hope, right? We have a Savior and we have hope. So even when things look really dark, and even when the timing is not like we think, like with Lazarus, or whatever, death happens like we experience in this broken world, for those who believe in Jesus, we know that that is not the end game. And we know that God is working all of it for good. So, okay, let's go ahead and wrap up with this final chapter. We're going to see that Jesus is betrayed, that he dies, and that he is resurrected again. Just like we talked about, as Jesus being the resurrection, he proved it by resurrecting. And how cool is that? Okay, so flip with me to John 21 with Peter. Hey, Kelly, I like your heart. So let's talk for a second. If you'll remember, Peter, Jesus had told Peter that he was going to deny Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. And Peter said, no, I will never do that. I'll never betray you, Lord. I'd rather die. I'm not going to betray you. And sure enough, he does. And then when Jesus comes back, I just love this intimate time that he has of restoring Peter. And sometimes we too can think that we are just too far gone, or that God could never forgive this. I intentionally sinned. I knew that I wasn't supposed to. I knew that it would hurt God's heart, or go against God's law, and I still did it anyways. And I'm too bad. Like, I can't, whatever it is, however big, quote unquote, the sin is, that God could never forgive this. We see this beautiful reconciliation and restoration that Jesus is offering Peter in the end of chapter 21. So it says, when they finished breakfast, this is verse 15, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? So this phrase, more than these, in verse 15, it could mean 2 things. So scholars say it could mean, do you love me more than the disciples love me? Like, do you love me the most? Or it could mean, do you love me more than you love all this? More than you love the disciples, more than you love the fishing and the nets and your profession and your security and your career. Do you love me more than all of this? Peter's going to answer, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, feed my lambs. And if you've heard sermons on this, you might have heard that this word love, do you love me? Of course I love you. Do you love me? Yes, I love you. That there are different verbs being used here. We won't dig into that a whole lot, but it's worth noting at least. So Jesus is going to ask him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. So we're seeing this shepherding continuation of what we've talked about for months now throughout the Old Testament, waiting for this shepherd, this good shepherd to come. We talked about it, I think we talked about it last week or the week before with one of the other Gospels as well, but waiting for this good shepherd. Even in Jesus' final exhortation to Peter, he is concerned with his flock, with the sheep that are entrusted to his care. So he's telling Peter, he's commanding and equipping him and also directing him to the church, saying, feed my lambs, tend my sheep. Verse 17, he says to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said the third time, do you love me? And so again, he's probably remembering the 3 times that he betrayed Jesus. Maybe it hadn't clicked for him why Jesus asked him a second time. But now at the third time, he remembered likely the 3 times that he betrayed Jesus and denied him. And now being restored, Jesus asks the third time, do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you're young, and he's going to talk about how he's going to die. And after saying all of this, he said to him, follow me. Okay, so what do you learn about Jesus, and what do you learn just about sin even, and our relationship with Jesus and our relationship with the Father? I think for me, some of the things that I learned, we're seeing that Jesus knew. Jesus knew from the beginning what was going to happen, and he knew even now the feelings that Peter would be feeling, probably shame, just intense embarrassment and shame and guilt. And instead of just ignoring them, instead of ignoring what he did, Jesus is going to have this conversation 3 times talking with Peter. And I just love, that's something that I've been meditating on recently, is how God is the one who erases our shame. We talked about it last week a little bit too, about how he not only cleanses our guilt, but also our shame. And so we're seeing that this restoration of Peter here. Something else that I love in this story is he's going to end with this phrase, follow me. That is the same phrase that was used at the very beginning. If you think back to the book of Mark, when Jesus was calling the fishermen, and what did he say? Follow me. And they left their nets and they followed him. They left their fathers and their families and all of these things, their professions and their careers, to follow him. even after Peter had sinned and even after he had betrayed Jesus, the same command is there. Follow me. And so I think it's worth us considering as well in our lives, how are we following Jesus? Do we love him more than these? Do we love him more than our everything? Family, our house, our career? Would you be willing to give up your career if God asked you to? Would you be willing to move houses to a lower income neighborhood to minister there if the Lord asked you to? Would you be willing to give it all up for his sake? And do you love him more than these? Do you love your kids more than God, more than Jesus? Practically, that can be hard to tell, but what do you hope in the most? What makes you the most nervous? What wakes you up in the middle of the night? Do you hope in and trust in the Lord? Or are you so concerned and fearful and just concerned, wrapped up in the life of your kids or your husband or the thought of your kids and husband or a future career? But do you love him more than these, whatever your these are? And just like he said to Peter, he so says to us, follow me. So the book is going to end, just another story that's unique here, but Peter's walking with Jesus, and he turns around and he sees John there, the beloved disciple, likely John, and he says, Lord, what about him? And Jesus is going to say essentially, don't worry about him. What is it to you if he lives forever or whatever? And just even here in this little story, we can see that we don't need to compare ourselves or our walks with the Lord to others, that our relationship with the Lord should be what we are focused and fixed on, that we don't have to be looking at others and say like, God, what about that person? Like, they're not doing so well right now. And man, are you going to take care of that? Like, should I take care of that? Are you going to take care of that? Or are they going to get rewarded because they pray a lot? Or whatever the things that we can get so silly and wrapped up in. But we should be concerned and fixed on the Lord, and not concerned or fixed on other people and what they're doing and how we compare to them and what we look like compared to them, how spiritual we are compared to them, all these things that we can compare on Facebook and Instagram and all the things. But again, we can fix our eyes on Jesus, and like Jesus says, what is it to you? What is it to me? In these things that we compare ourselves with. So the book ends. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And so I love that. It's basically saying, this can't even be written down. This is like, Jesus is so much better than we could ever describe and ever say and ever write down, ever tell. And so he is that good, and he is worth following. He is worthy of the glory that's ascribed to him in chapter 1 as the word, and he is worthy of us following him because he is the good shepherd who takes care of his sheep. So if you have any other thoughts about this book, we'd love to hear you, whether you're watching now or later, but I'm going to go ahead and log off now. Next week, just a reminder, so next week my kids have a ballet show at 7 o'clock, and so we will not be meeting at the usual time. I will put a note in the post for that morning, but we will be meeting at 3 p.m. on next Wednesday, whatever date that is. I think the 16th of November. So just write it on your calendar. Hope to see you then, and have a great week. Bye.